Dave Corinth here. Welcome to my shop. Today, I want to show you the progress I've made on my new till, particularly the planes section. I finally got around to putting some planes in this thing, and I want to show you how I got from this to this. So let's get started. In 30 years of woodworking, I've accumulated a lot of scrap pieces, and a lot of them from old upright grand pianos. So I decided to use those parts to make a new till. And it has turned out fabulous. I couldn't be happier with the results so far. A lot of mahogany and walnut, rosewood, ebony, even some chestnut. In the last video, I was able to get the saw till section completed, and now I want to start working on the planes. Originally, I had planned to use the center section of the till for levels, squares, and things like that, but I have since decided that I want to put the planes in the center section since it's the largest section. And I started this off by cutting some pieces of 3/4 inch plywood with a 7-degree bevel. In between each piece is a piece of walnut capped off by some mahogany. I can store 14 bench planes in this large center section, but I'm also going to have some other planes like tongue and groove planes, rabbet planes, chisel planes, things like that I'm going to store, which leaves no room for my block planes. So I'm going to use this side section, or at least the bottom portion of it, to store my block planes and 2 scrub planes. They are made in the same manner with a 7-degree back bevel, walnut in between, capped off by mahogany. Smack dab in the middle of where I'm going to store the bench planes is this pocket, and I want to do something special there. Now, I've had these 2 pieces of rosewood laying around the shop for quite some time, and it's time to actually use them. I'm going to turn 2 columns out of these pieces of rosewood, inspired by H.O. Studley. He has 2 of these columns in the pocket that holds his number 1, and I like the way that looks. Now, I'm no master wood turner. 99% of everything I turn is either plain knobs or small tool handles. So turning these columns that are 10 inches long won't be that difficult. It's really not much different than turning a knob or a large tool handle. Now, I had already made one of these columns, so I'm turning the second one here and using the original to check my measurements because I want these to be identical twins. There's only going to be 4 parts of these columns. I'm going to have the base, which is going to be square, the shaft, which is going to be round, and the capital that's going to be round. And on top of the capital is going to be a small tenon. That tenon will be set into a platform that will probably hold another plane. I'm not exactly sure yet, but I'm going to have a platform on top of these 2 columns to store more tools. The first column didn't take very long to turn because I basically freehanded it. I had no idea what I really wanted. I just started turning it, and when I came up with something that I liked, I stopped. So now I have to copy that, and it has to be an identical twin. I'm not following any of the rules of Palladio's proportions or anything like that. I'm basically doing what's fun and what I want to see. The inspiration for these columns, of course, came from H.O. Studley's tool chest, and I want them to look similar, but they won't be exact copies. They're actually going to be pretty simplified from what he has. Once the capital and the base are done, I can go ahead and finish the shaft. Now, this shaft isn't going to be fluted or anything fancy like that. It's going to be basically a Tuscan style, so it's going to be smooth, and it is tapered. Here I'm taking a strip of 220 grit sandpaper to smooth that column out. Now, you can't see this, but I'm wearing a mask. Rosewood dust can be some pretty nasty stuff. It can do a lot of damage to your lungs, so I wear a mask. And the final step is to turn down that little tenon to exactly 5/8 of an inch. And this is where these 2 columns will reside. And like I said, I'm going to put a platform on top of it, and I'm going to use some of those old piano parts, some mahogany veneer, to go on top. And to accent that, I've got some really, really nice cove molding that's solid mahogany. I'm going to leave the patina on there. I'm not going to strip these down, but I am going to put a fresh coat of finish. Before I go any further, I need to go ahead and secure these planks that the planes will sit on. Right now they move, and I can't locate the columns exactly until these are in place. So I want to go ahead and set the pieces of walnut and the planks together. But before I do that, I need to sand and stain them because these are going to be dark black. And I want to mark where each one went, so I'm going to use these punches to mark the backside with letters on the bench planes. And on the block planes, I use numbers so I don't get them mixed up. I'm not going to stain the backside, so I don't need to sand it. I only need to sand the face. And I'm using 180 grit sanding block to do that. I stained the back and the carcass of this till black, and here I'm using Minwax True Black oil stain to do the same with these planks. And I'm going to save you the boredom of watching me stain 24 of these planks with this True Black, so I just showed the first one and the last one. After they've sit for about 15 minutes, I'm just going to take a rag and wipe off the excess. When I stained the carcass in the back panel, a subscriber sent me a tip, and that was to spray some shellac on the stain before you put the finish on, and it will seal that black color in. And it works great. I've used it since then, and I really like that technique. I let the plank sit overnight, and of course, this morning I went in there and sprayed this shellac on, and it will dry fast. They can be lightly sanded after about 15 minutes, and you won't lose any of that dark black color. Then I can apply a couple of coats of that wipe-on satin polyurethane. Now I have decided that I'm going to go ahead and use magnets. It worked great the first time. I haven't had any planes fall off, so I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to use more magnets. This time, instead of using just 2, I'm going to use 3, and they're going to be larger. I need those magnets to be as close to the face of the plank as possible. So I had to do a little trick here. I used one Forstner bit to drill the main hole, and then went back with a second one that I ground the pilot off of to get it as close to that face as possible. And like I said, I'm using these rare earth magnets, and instead of using 2 like I did on the last hill, this time I'm going to use 3. And to set them in place, I'm just going to drop them in the hole and then apply some wood glue. Brush that around to get on the edges real well. I'm not worried about getting it on the magnet, just on the sides of that hole. And then I'm going to apply a plug. And I'm going to lightly tap that down until it hits those magnets. And those magnets are never coming out. Between the planks, I'm going to put these little strips of 1/4 inch thick black walnut. They'll divide the planks and they'll stand a little bit taller, preventing the planes from rubbing up against each other. They'll also break up the mass of that large, dark backdrop. Another function is to cover up the exposed plywood edges. I use plywood to make those planks, and since some of them are taller than the others, you can see the sides exposed. This will look a lot better seeing that black walnut than those exposed plywood ends. This little plane is perfect to remove those table saw marks left over when I cut these down to size. Now I can go ahead and glue up those pieces of walnut to the side of the planks. And all I'm going to do is glue them. There's not going to be any mechanical fasteners at all. No nails, no screws. And I'm only going to glue one piece of walnut to one plank. I'm not going to glue the whole set together. In the back of my head, I keep telling myself that someday I may want to modify this till. So from the outset, I've made sure that I could always take something off from the front. My old till, I couldn't do that. So if I wanted to modify it or take something off, I had to take the till off the wall. By gluing these up individually, I'm telling myself that someday I may be able to take them out. It won't be easy, but at least I won't have to take that till off of the wall and then come from the backside and remove screws. And now I can actually start to set these in place. I mark the bottom on the first one and the side so I can see where I want to drill the holes. Because I am going to fasten these with screws from the side and from the bottom, so they're accessible. I still have a few of those piano screws left, although I must say the stockpile is getting low, and I'm going to use up as many of them as I can. And from the outset, I said I wasn't going to buy anything to finish this till unless it was absolutely necessary. And in this case, it was necessary. I didn't have the right screws to screw these little mahogany blocks to the top of the planks, so I went to the hardware store and bought me some brass ones because I didn't want to use drywall screws. I wanted something that looked old, and these brass screws fit the bill. This mahogany block is placed at the top of all the other planks except the two at the very ends that will hold the number 7 planes, because I don't have a way to fasten them. So I'm going to screw these little mahogany blocks on the top, and then I can run a screw through the mahogany block to the back of the till. I'm going to cover those mahogany blocks up later with some rosewood so you won't even see the screws when I'm done. And that little piece of mahogany is left over from a project I did years ago when I was in my norm phase, where I like to use the biscuit cutter. Yeah, you can see a little bit of that biscuit still left in there, but it's going to get covered up so you won't see it. I used to have one of those plate joiners, a Porter cable plate joiner. I use a living daylights out of that, but I honestly don't think I've touched it in 10 years. When I set the next plank, all I have to do is mark the bottom. I don't have to worry about marking the sides because it's not going to get fastened on the side. All I do is mark the bottom, drill a hole, and then set a screw from the underside. And on the top, I'm just going to tap that screw to mark where it's going to get pre-drilled. Here I'm going to use a push drill just to pre-drill that hole so it's easier to set. And on the bottom of it, I'm going to use a countersink so that way that screw is nice and flush. I'm only using one screw to set the bottom of each plank. I don't think it needs any more than that. And on the top, just one screw for these single planks. I just want to make sure that it's lower than the surface of that little piece of mahogany because I am going to set a piece of rosewood to cover up that biscuit. Now, where I have planks that are the same size, I can go ahead and gang them together and set 2 or 3 at a time. So I'm just going to take a scrap piece of redwood that's about 3/8 of an inch thick and use that to secure these two pieces together. And of course, those are some piano screws that I still have. I have a lot of those, and I'd like to use those up. But they're not very long. They're only about maybe 5/8 of an inch long. So they only work well on small, thin stock, like this piece of redwood that I'm using to join these two together. And once they're ganged together, I can go ahead and use the same process that I used to install the previous panel. And even those that are ganged 3 together, same process, except I use 2 screws on top. And I repeat the same process on the other side. And it looks like I might have got a little bit too close to the edge where I drilled those holes for the magnets, but they're going to be covered by planes. Now I can go ahead and start working on that platform that goes above the 2 columns. And I'm going to reuse this piece of old mahogany that came off of one of the pianos. It's a mahogany veneer, but it is absolutely gorgeous. It looks ugly right now, but wait till you see it after I apply the finish. The color of that mahogany really starts to stand out. And I'm going to put about 3 coats of that wipe-on satin oil-based polyurethane. I'm also going to do the same thing to the little pieces of cove molding that are going to trim that piece out. And with the platform in place above those 2 columns, I can go ahead and start drilling the holes that are going to receive those 2 columns. And a little test fit to make sure those columns fit in those holes, and they fit perfect. And this trim is really going to set that off. I'm just going to glue these little pieces of cove to the platform. They're small and they won't be under any stress. And mahogany and poplar glue well, so I'm not worried about them ever coming off. Behind each column is a little piece of mahogany that's about 3/8 of an inch thick, and it's there to fill in that gap behind the angled plank. And it also gives me a surface to screw something onto if I need to. But they look out of place against that column with that straight edge, so I want to do some sort of design where it meets up against that column. I just don't know what yet. So first, I want to mark the top of the base so I can see where I want to start this detail. And then I want to mark the bottom of the capital so I can see where I want to end this detail. So here's what I came up with after a lot of head scratching. I'm going to put a little cove on the top, and then I'm going to run a straight line down about halfway just to open it up a little bit, and then I'm going to finish it off with an ogee. And we'll see how this looks. So far, I like it. Now let's go ahead and do the other one. I'm going to copy it, and then I'll take it over the bandsaw and cut it out. And after a test fit, I actually like that. I think that looks a lot better than just a straight plank. It kind of accents that column and makes it look a little fancier. So I think I did good on this one. Now, in my shop, I have a tendency to get a little ahead of myself, and this is one of those cases. I started recording, but I didn't check to see if the microphone was on, so there's no sound of me filing. But the important part is seeing it, and I did at least turn the camera on. And all I'm doing with this file is just removing those bandsaw marks. And this little Luthier's file that I got from Stu Mack or Stuart McDonald works perfect for this. I've had this file about 10 years and it's still as sharp as it was the day I got it. Okay, maybe not as sharp as it was the day I got it, but it still works great. One side of the file is flat and the other side is rounded, and it's really versatile. You can hit flat surfaces and, of course, that cove and this ogee with no problem. So then I'm going to take a small piece of 220 grit sandpaper and just kind of clean all those surfaces up, especially those round corners, and remove the file marks that I used to remove the bandsaw marks. And on the sides, I just want to clean them up just a little bit with my smoothing plane. They've been laying around in my wood pile for quite some time, and they've got some dings and bangs on them, and I want to remove those at least. The mahogany I'm using here is part of an old bar top. I drove by an old bar one day that was being tore down, and I saw these huge, long, like 14-foot long boards sitting out up against the dumpster. And so I stopped and asked, "Hey, what are you going to do with those?" And they said, "Well, they won't fit in the dumpster, so we're going to cut them in half." And I told them I'll take them. And so I took them home, and I've had this mahogany ever since, and I've used a bunch of it. But it's not as dark as the mahogany that is on the till. So I want to go ahead and use some red mahogany 225 to kind of darken it up so it matches the mahogany that is on the till, at least the mahogany from that old piano. I'll set this aside and let it dry, and then I'll apply a couple of coats of that shellac and then some wipe on poly to finish it off. Now back to the columns. I decided that I want to do some inlay work on the columns, and the only place to do it really is the base. So I have some of these piano keys left over, and I want to inlay three sides of the base of each column with this ivory. Inlay work isn't that difficult. Basically, you lay the item that you want to inlay on the piece. I like to use tape to hold it down, keep it on there a little bit better, and then you simply scribe the perimeter of the piece. Now, since I used tape to hold the piece down, that means I didn't mark the entire perimeter with the marking knife. So all I have to do is kind of connect the dots here with a straight edge, and in this case, a 6-inch rule. Once I have the outline of the item that I want to inlay marked, I'll go around it with a sharp chisel, in this case, a 5/16 mortising chisel. Once I have the outline marked, I like to go ahead and remove some of that material that I've marked with a small skew chisel. This shows a clear outline of what I want to remove. Once I have the outline clearly defined, I'll use the small router plane to remove the rest of that material on the inside. Now, these pieces of ivory are only about a 32nd of an inch thick, so I don't have to remove much. Once I have all the material removed for the inlay, it's time to go ahead and set these in place, and I'm going to use a two-part epoxy to do that. This epoxy has a 5-minute setting time, so after it's sat about 15 minutes, it's ready to sand. One down, five to go, and I'm not going to show you the other five because it's pretty much the exact same process. Now that those panels are dried, I can test fit this thing and see what it's going to look like. And those turned out fantastic. That mahogany has some beautiful grain and color. And I really like the way that ivory inlay turned out by putting it on the three sides that are exposed on each of those columns base. The finish on the columns is just going to be a couple of coats of tung oil. And wow, does that Cocobolo rosewood look wonderful. Now I can finally set the top platform and the columns in place. The mahogany side panels on the inside I attach with 2 screws on each panel to the plank next to it. And on top I'm just using 2 brass screws to attach to the tops of those mahogany panels. The columns will be glued into that plank on the top and then set in place on the bottom with a couple of screws. To finish off the mahogany caps on top of the planks and to cover up those screws, I'm going to use some Honduras rosewood. I did the same thing on the sawtill. I made some ebony diamonds and some ivory dots and blocks, and of course a couple of arrows. When I did the work on the sawtill section, I made a lot of dots, a lot of diamonds, and I made a couple of extra sets of those arrows just in case I screwed 1 or 2 of them up. So I don't have to make any for this part. Following the theme that I used on the sawtill, I want a couple of arrows with a dot in the middle. And then I'm going to put a ebony diamond on each end. But then I realized that's not what I did on the sawtill. I put a couple of ivory dots on each end. So we're going to take those off and put a couple of those ivory dots. And for the smaller section, there's no arrows. I've just got the dots and the diamonds. So I'm kind of playing with the layout of these dots and diamonds, and I'm pretty happy with the way this looks. But I don't like the middle one, so I'm going to take that out, add another dot, and then another diamond. I think that looks a lot better. Now, I don't want to glue these because I may want to take them off someday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screw them down to the mahogany block with some small screws on each end. And then I'm going to cover those screws with some of those ivory dots. The idea is that if I ever want to take this thing apart, I can do it. And I have a lot of those dots, so if I need to replace one, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to set a dab of epoxy on top of each screw and then lay the dot on top of it. After that epoxy has set for about 15 minutes, it's time to go ahead and sand those down and make sure those dots in the rosewood are flush. I had been hearing a lot about Glancy's #1 oil, and I wanted to try some out. So I went to Union Manufacturing's website and I bought me a bottle of that oil. And I must say, I am very impressed with it. It really brings out the color of that rosewood. Now I went ahead and skipped to the finishing part on this because I decided not to show the work of inlaying the dots and diamonds because I did that in the sawtill video. I also did the arrows in that video. So if you want to see that work, just check out the sawtill video and you can see where I did the dot, diamonds, and of course the arrow inlay. Now these dots, diamonds, and arrows will tie into what I did with the sawtill. And they're also a clear tribute to Mr. Studley because he uses those dots and arrows in ivory on his tool chest as well. And I like the way that looks, and I wanted to pay tribute to Mr. Studley. Next, I can focus my attention to the block plates, and after test fitting them, I realized I had one small problem. The eccentric lever on some of those block planes extends past the plank and gets into that mahogany. So after a fair amount of head scratching, I've come up with this solution. I'm going to use my 2.5-inch face mill to cut some semicircles into that mahogany cap, so those eccentric levers are not in the way. Now I know you're not supposed to use your end mill to be cutting wood because the sawdust can really get inside the ways and really jam them up and mess up that grease. So as soon as I got done with this, I cleaned it up thoroughly and got rid of all that sawdust. So with those semicircles cut, I can test fit it and see if they're going to be in the way now. And they fit much better. No longer is that eccentric lever protruding into that mahogany. Now originally I was going to cover up that cap with this piece of rosewood run horizontally, but now I want to run it vertically. And running that rosewood vertically in smaller blocks gives me the chance to use up some more of these piano keys. And I still have a lot of them that I haven't used. So what I've come up with is I've cut them down to 1/4 inch thick and then I split them in half. And then I'm going to put one on top of the other offset. And after a little bit of artistic endeavors with them, this is what I have come up with. They're going to go on top of each of those walnut dividers, and they're going to become caps to the ends of that rosewood. Now I'm going to install these little pieces of ebony on top of the dividers with screws because I don't want to glue them because I may want to take it apart someday. And I'm going to use these round-headed slotted brass screws to attach those ebony caps. Originally, I had some nickel-plated screws that came from that piano, but they weren't long enough to reach that walnut on the bottom, at least not long enough that I thought they could stay in place. So I went and bought these little brass screws because they were a little bit longer. And I think the brass will look good up against that ebony. Now the little piece of rosewood will sit between those ebony caps. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that same semicircle shape into each one of those with a bevel to kind of dress it up a little bit. And to create that bevel, I'm going to go ahead and use this little drum sander. And it's going to go ahead and remove those bandsaw marks first, and then I can tilt that piece of rosewood slightly until I get the bevel that I want. And to secure these pieces of rosewood, you guessed it, I'm going to use screws. And of course, these little ivory dots to cover those screws up. Because, yeah, you guessed it, I may want to take this thing apart someday. And this way I'll be able to do it. And once I had this one completed, I had to do it 14 more times. And to finish these up, I'm going to use some more of that Glancy's oil. I'll end up putting 2 or 3 coats of this on there, but I really like the way this stuff works, especially on these smaller parts. I went ahead and hit those ebony caps as well before I installed them, and then I'll go ahead and hit them again. The oil really brings out that color in that rosewood. And it makes those ivory dots look even wider than they already were. Now, I mulled over this section of the till a long time. I had some different ideas, and I would just step back and look at it and just crunch my brain till I came up with something that I thought would look appropriate. And I think this works well. Originally, I wasn't going to use magnets, but the more I thought about it, I realized they worked well on my other till, so they'll work fine on this one. And in this case, I actually bought more magnets and I got bigger magnets. So these will even hold it stronger than the previous till. And while this takes care of my bench planes and my block planes, I still have other planes that I want to put on this till. So I've still got a lot of work to do, but so far I'm happy with the progress. And now I can go ahead and start putting some planes in there and see how it's going to look. First, I installed the scrub plane, and then, of course, I have room for 8 block planes. Next, I can install the bench planes, and I'll have room for 14 bench planes, which is a lot more than my last till, and actually I'll have room for 15 if you include that beautiful infill that Michael Jinks sent me. And below that infill is that center section with those 2 beautiful Cocobolo columns. I really don't know what I'm going to do with it yet, but I guarantee you I'm going to put some of my 101s in there, and maybe even a number 1 someday. So now I have to figure out how to get these transitionals onto the till so they won't fall off, because right now I have been using magnets to hold all of the cast iron planes on, but these are not cast iron, they are wood, so obviously magnets won't stick to it. So what I've got to do is I've got to make a system or a way to hold these planes in place. And what I'm going to do is I have this huge piece of mahogany. It's actually a plywood, kind of. It's 2 very thin veneers that are about a 1/2 inch thick total, sandwiched between a piece of cypress. And this came off of a door, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It doesn't look like it now, but it needs some work. It's got a water stain up here, but this will clean up great. The idea is to take pieces of mahogany, something like so, and then make it to where the planes will sit between the mahogany in a pocket so they won't fall out. So that's what I've got to do to this till next. And once I get that done, I'm going to hang that bad boy up on the wall. So comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll make more. And of course, thank you for watching. And if you have any advice on how to put these on better, I'm all ears. So put it in the comments, and I will definitely take it into consideration. Again, thank you for watching.